Let's see, is it gonna work? Oh, sounds like it's working. Oh, sounds like we got a lot of echo. Maybe that's just me though. I don't know why I would have echo. Man, as soon as I hit that start stream, I started yawning. Congrats on getting first. Guilty. You are guilty of being here. Okay, I'm just hearing a lag between my recording and my browser, so at least I know I'm here, sorta, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, why am I yawning so much? And my computer's freezing. Wonderful. Okay. Yes, I will hydrate. Where did I put my water bottle? Just put my water bottle on a different level. My ear scritches are shoulder ones right now. Okay, well, some of the things I haven't been able to reset on this one because I haven't been able to get everything working properly. But what is the stream without scuff? Clearly not mine. Sorry about all the yawning. That has been a fairly cool day today, so that'll get me yawning every time. Right. But doing more of the rivals of Sherlock Holmes tonight, so let me go ahead and get switched over to the room. And how long does it take for this room to reload? Okay, looks like everything's up. Myself a little bit smaller so I fit my chair right. Man. This is better than when we're working at a call center. As soon as I answer the phone, I start coughing. And as soon as I start streaming, I start yawning. But I'm going to try to get 2 stories done tonight. I'm going to check something real quick. It looks like I'm doing more Loveday Brooks. How long are these? I have one more Loveday Brooke, and it's 16 pages long, and then stories from the Diary of a Doctor, and it's a 15 page. Shouldn't be too bad tonight. I haven't started trying to get enough of these sorted on the YouTube channel to really change anything. Hold on. Wish they'd had a better place to put the mute button on my microphone than the top of it. I think it's weird that I actually went ahead and posted the message about how many likes to get a year's supply of Scooby crackers. I'm pretty sure Kellogg's just going to ignore it. But it'd be funny. Oh, hell, I hear that. Will it play on the stream? Maybe. No. So did you hear that, or was it just me? Hey, Joe. What's up? Can you at least hear my fireplace? I really wish I knew why the sound alerts were not working. And that was even blurb. It's not even part of the sound alert set. That's normally working. Let's see. I love when things work. Really wish they'd do it more often. OBS, why must you fail me so? It says blurb is on. Okay, and that one's not playing out loud either. You follow their directions and nothing wants to work. Everything's turned up on it. Everything's set up on there. It's just not set to go to the VOD track, because I don't have to deal with copyright issues. I'm gonna turn off all my point readings because nothing works. Blurb is usually really good about working. just get them turned off. But the head scritches work, so I don't know why that wouldn't. Well, that's an entirely different program for that. I wonder if the TTS at least works. Really? I don't change my settings from week to week, and yet it still screws itself up. Doesn't work. I heard it. Did you at least hear the TTS? I didn't hear it. Okay, well, I guess I'll have to turn that one off too. I'm glad I'm not paying for all those. I'd be really pissed. Anyway, can you at least hear the fireplace? My ambiance. Oh well. It's already past time, so we should really get into the story. I'm not even going to advertise my book or anything. Everyone knows about it. And Kel advertised what? My donation links? Yeah, she posted my donation links. Ooh, wait. One thing about it. I did not say Gurry. What the hell? Kel is on crack, apparently. Unreckon. There we go. I got the Joe shout out. But I really wonder what is going on with my shout out commands. And it's bad enough my sound alerts aren't working. And then my shout outs are just shouting out whoever. Okay, now it worked. Yeah, so the one for... Joe worked. Why did it shout out Gurry again? What the hell? Ah, that's okay. Job stuff is important. Glad you can buy anyway. So. Okay. So our first story for the evening. The Experiences of Loveday Brooke, Lady Detective. The Murder at Troyte's Hill. Griffiths of the Newcastle Constabulary has been case at hand, said Mr. Dyer. Those Newcastle men are keen-witted, shrewd fellows, and very jealous of outside interference. We only sensed me under protest, as it were, because they wanted your sharp wits at work inside the house. I suppose throughout I am to work with Griffiths, not with you, said Miss Brooke. Yes, when I have given you the outline of the facts of the case, I simply have nothing more to do with it, and you must depend on Griffiths for any assistance in any sort that you may require. Here with a swig, Mr. Dyer opened his big ledger and turned rapidly over the leaves until he came to the heading, Troyte's Hill, and the date September 6th. I'm all attention, said Loveday, leaning back in her chair in her attitude of a listener. The murdered man, resumed Mr. Dyer, is a certain Alexander Henderson, usually known as Old Sandy, lodge keeper of Mr. Craven of Troyte's Hill, Cumberland. The lodge consists merely of two rooms on the ground floor and a bedroom and a sitting room. These Sandy occupied alone, having neither kith nor kin of any degree. On the morning of September 6th, some children going up to the house with milk from the farm noticed that Sandy's bedroom window stood wide open. Curiosity prompted them to peep in, and then, to their horror, they saw old Sandy in his nightshirt lying dead on the floor, as if he had fallen backwards from the window. They raised an alarm, and on examination it was found that death had ensued from a heavy blow on the temple, either given by a strong fist or some blunt instrument. The room, on being entered, presented a curious appearance. It was as if a herd of monkeys had been turned into it and allowed to work their impish will. Not an article of furniture remained in its place. The bedclothes had been rolled into a bundle and stuffed into the chimney. The bedstead, a small iron one, lay on its side, and one chair in the room stood on top of the table. Fender fire irons lay across the washstand, whose basin was to be found in the farther corner, holding bolster and pillow. The clock stood on its head in the middle of the mantelpiece. The small vases and ornaments were flanked on either side of it, or walking, as it were, in a straight line towards the door. The old man's clothes had been rolled up into a ball and thrown on the top of a high cupboard in which he kept his savings and whatever valuables he had. This cupboard, however, had not been meddled with, and its contents remained intact, so it is evident that robbery was not the motive of the crime. At the inquest, subsequently held, a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown was returned. The local police are diligently investigating the affair, but as yet have no arrests been made. The opinion at the present prevails in the neighborhood is that the crime was perpetrated by some lunatic, escaped or otherwise, and inquiries were being made by local asylums as to anyone missing or lately released inmates. Griffiths, however, tells me that the suspicions set in another direction. Did anything of importance transpire at the inquest? Nothing especially important. Mr. Craven broke down in giving his evidence, which he alluded to be confidential relations that he had always subsisted between Sandy and himself, and spoke of the last time he had seen him alive. The evidence of the butler, or one or two of the female servants, seems clear enough, and they let fall something of a hint that Sandy was not altogether a favorite among them, on account of the overbearing manner in which he used his influence with his master. Young Mr. Craven, a youth about 19, home from Oxford after a long vacation, was not present at the inquest. A doctor's certificate was put in stating that he was suffering from typhoid fever, and could not leave his bed without risk to life. Now, this young man is a thoroughly bad sort, and as much a gentleman backleg as it is to be possible for such a young fellow to be. It seems to Griffiths that there is something suspicious about his illness. He came back from Oxford on the verge of delirium tremblings, pulling around that and this suddenly, and on the day of the murder, Mrs. Craven rings the bell, announces that he has developed typhoid fever, and orders a doctor to be sent for. What sort of man is Mr. Craven, Senior? He seems to be a great, quiet fellow, and a scholar and learned philologist. Neither his neighbors nor his family see much of him. He almost lives in his study, writing a treatise, and 7 or 8 volumes on comparative philology. He is not a rich man. Troyte's Hill, though it carries a position in the country, is not a paying property, and Mr. Craven is unable to keep it up properly. I am told that he has had to cut down expenses on all directions in order to send his son to college, and his daughter from first to last has been entirely educated by her mother. Mrs. Craven was originally intended for the church, but for some reason or other, when he went to college, his career came to an end, and he did not present himself for ordination. Went out in Natal instead, where he obtained some civil appointment and where he remained for about 15 years. Henderson was his servant during the latter portion of his Oxford career, and he must have been greatly respected by him, for although the remuneration divided as small opponents of Natal was small, and he paid Sandy a regular yearly allowance out of it. When about 10 years ago, he succeeded to Troyte's Hill on the death of his elder brother, and returned home with his family. Sandy was immediately installed as a lodgekeeper, and at so high a rate of pay that the butler's wages were cut to meet it. That wouldn't improve the butler's feelings towards him, ejaculated Loveday. Mr. Dyer went on. But in spite of his high wages, he doesn't appear to have troubled much about his duties as lodgekeeper, for they were performed, as a rule, by the gardener's boy, while he took his meals and passed his time at the house, and, speaking generally, he put his finger into every pie. You know the old adage respecting the servants for 21 years standing? 7 years my servants, 7 years my equal, 7 years my master. Well, it appears to have been held good in the case of Mr. Craven and Sandy. The old gentleman, absorbed by his philological studies, evidently let the reins slip through his fingers, and Sandy seemed to have taken easy possession of them. The servants frequently had to go to him for their orders, and he carried things, as a rule, with a high hand. Did Mrs. Craven never have a word to say on the matter? I have not heard much about her. She seems to be quite a sort of person. She is a Scotch missionary's daughter. Perhaps she spends time working with the Cape Mission and that sort of thing. And Mr. Craven, did he knock under the Sandy's rule? Now you're hitting the bullseye, and we come to Griffith's theory. The young man and Sandy appear to have been loggerheads since the Cravens took possession of Troyte's Hill. As a schoolboy, Master Harry defended Sandy and threatened him with his riding crop, and subsequently, as a young man, he used strenuous endeavors to put the old man in his place. On the day before the murder, Griffith says, there was a terrible scene between the two, in which the young gentleman, in the presence of several witnesses, made use of strong language and threatened the old man's life. Now, Miss Brooke, I have told you so far all of the circumstances of the case that I know of. For further particulars, I must refer you to Griffiths. He no doubt will meet you at Grenfell, the nearest station to Troyte's Hill, and tell you what capacity he has procured for you an entrance into the house. By the way, he has wired me to this morning that he hopes that you will have time to save Scotch Express tonight. Loveday expresses her readiness to comply with Mr. Griffith's wishes. I will be glad, said Mr. Dyer as he shook hands with her at the office door, to see you immediately upon your return. That, however, I suppose, will not yet be a while. This promises, I fancy, to be a longish affair. This was said interrogatively. I haven't the least idea on the matter, answered Loveday. I start on my work without theory of any sort. In fact, I may say with my mind a perfect blank. And anyone who had caught a glimpse of her blank, expressionless features as she said this would have taken her at her word. Grenfell, the nearest post town to Troyte Hill, was a fairly busy, populous little town, looking south towards the Black Country, and northwards to low, barren hills. Preeminent among these stands Troyte Hill, famed in the old days as a border keep, and possibly at a still earlier date as a Druid stronghold. At the small inn in Grenfell, dignified by the title of the Station Hotel, Mr. Griffiths of the Newcastle Constabulary met Loveday and still further initiated her into the mysteries of the Troyte Hill murder. Although the first experience is excited, he said, as a preliminary greeting had been exchanged, but still the wildest rumors are flying about and repeated as solemnly as if they were gospel truths. My chief here and my colleagues generally adhere to the first conviction, that the criminal is some suddenly crazed tramp or some otherwise escaped lunatic, and they are confident that sooner or later we shall come upon the traces. Their theory is that Sandy, hearing some strange noise at the park gates, put his head out of the window to ascertain the cause and immediately had his death blow dealt to him. Then they suppose that the lunatic scrambled into the room through the window and exhausted his frenzy by turning things generally upside down. They refuse altogether to share my suspicions, suspecting young Mr. Craven. Mr. Griffiths was a tall, thin-featured man with iron-gray hair, cut so close to his head that it refused to do anything but stand on end. This gave a somewhat comic expression to the upper portion of his face, and clashed oddly with his melancholy look that his mouth habitually wore. I've made it smooth for you at Troyte Hill, he presently went on. Mr. Craven is not wealthy enough to allow himself the luxury of a family lawyer, so he occasionally employs the services of Messrs. Wells and Sugden, lawyers in the place, and who, as it happens, have, off and on, done a good deal of business for me. It was through them that I heard that Mr. Craven was anxious to secure an assistance to the amanuensis. I immediately offered your services, stating that you were a friend of mine, a lady of impoverished means, who would gladly undertake the duties of a munificent sum of £1 a month, and board and lodging. The old gentleman at once jumped at the offer, and is anxious for you to be at Troyte Hill at once. Loveday expressed her satisfaction with the program that Mr. Griffiths had sketched for her, and then she had a few questions to ask. Tell me, she said, what led you in the first instance to suspect young Mr. Craven of the crime? The footing on which he and Sandy took towards each other, and the terrible scene that occurred between them only the day before the murder, answered Griffiths promptly. Nothing of this, however, has elicited the inquest, where a very fair face was put on Sandy's relations with the whole of the Craven family. I have subsequently unearthed a good deal of respecting of the private life of Mr. Harry Craven, and among other things I have found out that on the night of the murder he left the house shortly after 10 o'clock, and no one, so far as I have been able to ascertain, knows at what hour he had returned. I must draw your attention, Miss Brooke, to the fact in the inquest of the medical evidence which to prove that the murder had been committed between 10 and 11 at night. Do you surmise, then, that the murder was a planned thing on the part of this young man? I do. I believe that they wandered about the grounds until Sandy shut himself in for the night, then roused him by some noise outside, and then, when the old man looked out to ascertain the cause, dealt him a blow with a bludgeon and loaded stick that caused his death. Cold-blooded crime, that, for a boy of 19. Yes, he's a good-looking gentleman youngster, too, with manners and mild as milk, but from all the accounts, full of wickedness as an egg is full of meat. Now, to come to another point, if in connection with these ugly facts you take into consideration the suddenness of this illness, I think you'll admit that it bears a suspicious appearance, and might reasonably give rise to the surmise that it was a plant on his part, in order to get out of the inquest. Who is the doctor who is attending him? A man called Waters. Not much of a practitioner from all accounts, but no doubt he feels himself highly honored in being summoned to Troyte Hill. The Cravens, it seems, have no family doctor. Mrs. Craven, with her missionary experience, is half a doctor herself, and never calls in one except for serious emergency. The certificate was in order, I suppose? Undoubtedly. And as it was to give color to the gravity of the case, Mrs. Craven sent a message down from the servants, that if any of them were afraid of the infection, they could go at once to their homes. Several of the maids, I believe, took advantage of her permission, and packed their boxes. Miss Craven is a delicate girl who was sent away with her maid to stay with her friends in Newcastle, and Mrs. Craven isolated herself with her patient in one of the disused wings of the house. Has anyone ascertained whether Miss Craven arrived at her destination in Newcastle? Griffiths drew his brows together in thought. I did not see any necessity for such a thing, he answered. I don't quite follow you. What do you mean to imply? Oh, nothing. I don't suppose it matters much. It might have been interesting as a side issue. She broke off for a moment, and then added, Now tell me a little about this butler, the man whose wages were cut to increase Sandy's pay. Oh, John Hales? He's a trustworthy, though, respectable man. He was a butler for 5 or 6 years to Mr. Craven's brother, and then when the master of the Troyte Hill, and took the duties under Mr. Craven. There's no ground for suspicion in this quarter. Hales's exclamation when he heard the murder is quite enough to stamp him as an innocent man. Serve the cold idiot right, he cried. I couldn't pin up a tear for him, and if I tried, it's a month of Sundays. Now I take it, Miss Brooke, a guilty man wouldn't dare to make such a speech as that. You think not? Griffiths stared at her. I'm a little disappointed in her, he thought. I'm afraid her powers have been quite slightly exaggerated, if she can't see such a straightforward thing as that. Aloud he said, a little sharply, Oh, no, I don't stand alone in my thinking. No one has yet breathed a word about Hales, and if they did, they've no doubt could prove the alibi without any trouble, for he lives in the house, for everyone has a good word of him. I suppose Sandy's lodge has been put into order at this time? Yes, after the inquest, when all possible evidence had been taken, everything was put straight. At the inquest, it was stated that no marks of footsteps could be traced in any direction. The long draughted would have rendered such a thing impossible, let alone the fact that Sandy's lodge stands right at the gravelled driveway without flower beds, or grass borders, or anything of the sort around it. But look here, Miss Brooke, don't you be wanting your time at the lodge and its surroundings. Every iota of the facts in the matter has been gone through over and over again by me and the chief. What we want you to do is go straight into the house and concentrate attention on Master Harry's sick room, and find out what's going on there. What did he do outside the house on the 6th? And no doubt I shall find able to find out myself. Now, Miss Brooke, you've asked me no end of questions, to which I have replied as fully as it is in my power to do so. Will you be good enough to answer one question that I wish to put as straightforwardly as I have answered yours? have the fullest particulars given to you of the condition of Sandy's room when the police entered it this morning and after the murder. No doubt, at the present, you can see it all in your mind's eye. The bedstead on its side, the clock on its head, the bedclothes halfway up the chimney, the little vases and ornaments walking in a straight line towards the door. Loveday bowed her head. Very well. Now will you be good enough to tell me what the scene confusion recalls to your mind before anything else? The room of an unpopular Oxford freshman after a raid upon its undergrads, answered Loveday promptly. Mr. Griffiths rubbed his hands. Quite so, he ejaculated. I see, after all, that we are at one heart in this matter, in spite of the little surface disagreement of ideas. Depend upon it, by and by, like the engineers tunneling from different quarters under the Alps, we shall meet at the same point and shake hands. By the way, I have arranged the daily communication between us through the postboy who takes the letters to Troyte Hill. He is trustworthy, and any letter you give him for me will find its way into my hands within an hour. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Loveday drove through the park gates of Troyte Hill, past the lodge where old Sandy had met his death. It was a pretty little cottage, covered with Virginia creeper and wild honeysuckle, and showing no outward sign of the tragedy that had been enacted within. The park and pleasure grounds of Troyte Hill were extensive, and the house itself was a somewhat imposing red brick structure, built possibly at the time in which Dutch William's taste had grown popular in the country. The frontage presented a somewhat forlorn appearance, its center windows, a square of 8, alone seeming to show signs of occupation. With the exception of 2 windows at the extreme end of the bedroom floor, the north wing, where, possibly, the invalid and his mother were located, and 2 windows with the extreme end of the ground floor of the south wing, which Loveday ascertained subsequently which those were Mr. Craven's study. Not a single window in either wing owned a blind or curtain. The wings were extensive, and it was easy to understand that an extreme end of one for the fever patient would be isolated from the rest of the household, and that the extreme end of the other Mr. Craven could secure in the quiet and freedom of interruption, which, no doubt, were essential in his due prosecution of his philological ideas. Alike on the house were ill-kept grounds, where presents the stamp of smallness of the income of the master and owner of the place. The terrace, which ran from the length of the house to the front, and onto which every window of the ground floor opened, was miserably out of repair. Not a lintel or post or window ledge or balcony, but what seemed to cry aloud for the touch of a painter. "Pity me, I have seen better days," Loveday could fancy written a legend across the red brick porch, which gave entrance to the old house. The butler, John Hales, admitted Loveday, shouldered her portmanteau, and told her he would show her to her room. He was a tall, powerfully built man with a ruddy face and dogged expression of countenance. It was easy to understand that, off and on, there must have been a many sharp encounter between him and old Sandy. He treated Loveday in an easy, familiar fashion, evidently considering that the amanuensis took much of the same rank as a nursery governess. That is to say, a little below a lady's maid and a little above a housemaid. "We're short of hands, you know," he said, with a broad Cumberland dialect. He led the way up some wide staircase. "Some of the lasses downstairs took fright at the fever and went home. Cook and I are single-handed, and Moggy, the only maid left, has been told off to wait on Madam and Master Harry. I hope you're not afraid of a little fever?" Loveday explained that she was not, and asked if the room at the extreme end of the north wing was the one assigned to Madam and Master Harry. "Yes," said the man. "It's a convenient for sick nursing. There's a flight of stairs that runs down from it to the kitchen quarters. We put all Madam wants on the foot of those stairs, and Moggy comes down and fetches it. Moggy herself never enters the sick room. I take it you'll not be seeing Madam for many days yet a while." "When shall I see Mr. Craven? At dinner tonight?" "That's what naebody can say," said Hales. He may not come out of his study till past midnight. Sometimes he sits there till 2 or 3 in the morning. Shouldn't advise you to wait till he wants his dinner. Better have a cup of tea and chops sent up to you. Madam never waits for him any more. As he finished speaking, he deposited the portmanteau outside of one of many doors opening into the gallery. "This is Miss Craven's room," he went on. "Cook and me thought you'd better have it, as it would start less wanting to get ready from the other rooms. The work is work where there's so few hands to do. Oh, my stars, I do declare the cook is putting it straight for you now." The last sentence was added as the open door was laid bare to view. The cook, with a duster in her hand, polishing a mirror. The bed had been made, as it was true, and otherwise the room must have been much to Miss Craven left it, after a hurried packing up. To the surprise of the two servants, Loveday took the matter very lightly. "I have a special talent for arranging rooms, and would prefer getting this one straight for myself," she said. "Now, if you will go and get ready that chop and cup of tea we were talking about just now, I shall think it would be kinder than if you wish to stay here doing what I can easily do for myself." When, however, the cook and the butler had departed in company, Loveday showed no disposition to exercise that special talent of which she had boasted. She first carefully turned the key in the lock, and then proceeded to make a thorough and minute investigation of every corner of the room. Not an article of furniture, not an ornament or toilet accessory, but what was lifted from its place and carefully scrutinized. Even the ashes from the grate, the debris of the last fire made, were raked over and looked through thoroughly. This careful investigation of Miss Craven's last surroundings occupied about 3/4 of an hour, and Loveday, with her hat in her hand, descended the stairs to see Hales crossing the hall to the dining room with a promised cup of tea and chop. In silence and solitude she partook the simple repast in the dining hall, and that could with ease have banqueted 150 guests. "Now for the grounds before it gets dark," she said to herself as she noted that already the outside shadows were beginning to slant. The dining hall was at the back of the house, and here, as in the front, the windows reaching the ground presented easy means to the grass. The flower garden was on this side of the house, and sloped downhill to a pretty stretch of well-wooded country. Loveday did not linger even to admire, but passed once around the south corner of the house to the window which she had ascertained by a careful question of the butler were those of Mr. Craven's study. Well, very cautiously she drew near them, and the blinds were up and the curtains drawn back. A side glance, however, relieved her of apprehensions, for it showed the occupant of the room seated in an easy-chair with his back to the window. From the length of his outstretched limbs, he was evidently a tall man. His hair was silvery and curly, and the lower part of his face was hidden from her view by the chair, but she could see in one hand pressed tightly against his eyes and brows. The whole attitude was that of a man absorbed in deep thought. The room was comfortably furnished, but presented an appearance of disorder from the books and manuscripts scattered in all directions. The whole pile of torn fragments of foolscap sheets, overflowing from a waste paper basket outside the writing table, seemed to proclaim that fact that the scholar had of late grown weary or dissatisfied with his work, and had condemned it freely. Although Loveday stood looking in this window for over 5 minutes, not the faintest sign of life did that tall, reclining figure give, and it would have been as easy to believe him locked into sleep as in thought. From here she turned her steps to the direction of Sandy's lodge. As Griffiths said, it was gravelled up to its doorstep. The blinds were closed, drawn, and presented an ordinary appearance of a disused cottage. A narrow path beneath overarching boughs with cherry laurel and arquebus, immediately facing the lodge, caught her eye, and down at this she at once turned her footsteps. This path led, with many a wind and turn, through a belt of shrubbery that skirted the frontage of Mr. Craven's grounds, and eventually, after much zigzagging, ended up in close proximity to the stables. As Loveday entered it, she literally seemed to leave daylight behind her. I feel as if I were following the course of a circumcised mind, she said to herself as the shadows closed around her. I could not fancy Sir Isaac Newton nor Bacon planning or delighting in such wind-about alley this way. The path showed grayly in front of her out of the dimness. On and on she followed it. There and here the roots of old laurel struggling out of the ground, threatening to trip her up. Her eyes, however, had now grown accustomed to the half-gloom, and not the detail of her surroundings escaped with her being as she went along. A bird flew out from the thicket on her right hand, and with a startled cry, a dainty little frog leaped out of her way into the shriveled leaves lying below the laurels. Following the movements of the frog, her eye was caught by something black and solid among the leaves. What was it? A bundle. A shiny black coat. Loveday knelt down and, using her hand to assist her eyes, found that they had come into contact with the dead, stiffened body of a beautiful black retriever. She parted, as she was able, the lower boughs of the evergreens and minutely examined the poor animal. Its eyes were still open, though glazed and bleared, and its death had, undoubtedly, been caused by a blow of some blunt, heavy instrument, for one side of its skull was almost battered in. Exactly the death that was dealt to Sandy, she thought, as she groped hither and thither beneath the trees, in hopes of lighting upon the weapon of destruction. She searched until increasing darkness warned her that the search was useless. Then, still following the zigzagging path, she made her way out by the stables and thence back to the house. She went to bed that night without having spoken to a soul beyond the cook and butler. The next morning, however, Mr. Craven introduced himself to her across the breakfast table. He was a man of really handsome personal appearance, with a fine carriage of the head and shoulders, and eyes that had a forlorn, appealing look in them. He entered the room with an air of great energy, apologized to Loveday for the absence of his wife and of his own reminiscence, and not being in the way to receive her on the previous day. Then he bade her make herself at home at the breakfast table, and expressed his delight in having found a coadjutor to his work. I hope you understand what his great, stupendous work it is, he added when he sank into his chair. It's a work that will leave its impress upon the thought in the ages to come. Only a man who's had studied comparative philology, as I have for the past 30 years, could gauge the magnitude of what the task that I have set myself. With the last remark, the energy seemed spent, and he sank back into his chair, covering his eyes with his hand in precisely the same attitude as that in which Loveday had seen him the night, and utterly oblivious to the fact that breakfast was before him, and a stranger guest was seated at the table. The butler entered with another dish. "Better go on with your breakfast," he answered to Loveday. "You may sit like that for another hour." He placed his dish in front of his master. "Captain hasn't come back yet, sir," he said, making an effort to arouse him from his reverie. What?" said Mr. Craven, for a moment lifting his hand from his eyes. "Captain, sir, the black retriever," repeated the man. The pathetic look in Mr. Craven's eyes deepened. "Ah, poor Captain," he murmured. "The best dog I ever had." Then he sank back into his chair, putting his hand onto his forehead. The butler made one more effort to arouse him. "Madam sent you down a newspaper, sir, that she thought you would like to see." He shouted almost into his master's ear, and at the same time laid the morning paper on the table beside his plate. "Confound you, leave it there," said Mr. Craven irritably. "Fools, dolts, that you all are. With your trivialities and interruptions, so you're sending me out into the world with my study undone." And again he sank back into his chair and closed his eyes and became lost to his surroundings. Loveday went on with her breakfast. She changed her place at the table to come to Mr. Craven's right hand, so that the newspaper sent down to the perusal lay between his plate and hers. It was folded into an oblong shape, as if it were wished to direct attention upon a certain portion of a certain column. The clock in the corner of the room struck an hour with a loud, resonant tone. Mr. Craven gave a start and rubbed his eyes. "Yep, what's this?" he said. "What meal are we at?" He looked around with a bewildered air. Who are you?" he went on, staring at Loveday. "What are you doing here? Where's Nina? Where's Harry?" Loveday began to explain, and gradually recollection seemed to come back to him. Yes, he said. "I remember. You've come to assist me with my great work. You promised, to help me out with a hole if I got into you. Very enthusiastic. I remember they said you were on certain abstruse points of comparative philology. Now, I've forgotten your name. Tell me a little of what you know about the elemental sounds of speech that are common in all languages." Now, to know how many you would reduce the elemental sounds to 6, 8, 9? No, we won't discuss the matter here. The cups and saucers distract me. Come into my den at the other end of the house, and we'll have perfect quiet there. And utterly ignoring the fact that he had not yet broken his fast, he rose from the table, seized Loveday by the wrist, and led her down the rooms and down to the long corridor that led through the south wing to his study. But seated in that study, his energy once more speedily exhausted itself. He placed Loveday into a comfortable chair at his writing table, consulted her to taste as to pens, and spread a sheet of foolscap before her. Then he settled himself in his easy chair and went back to the light, as if he were about to dictate folios to her. In a loud, distinct voice, he repeated the title of his learned work, then the subdivision, then the number and the heading of the chapter that was at present engaging his attention. Then he put his hand to his head. "It's the elemental sounds that are my stumbling block," he said. "Now, how on earth is it possible to get a notion of a sound of agony that is not part of a sound of terror, or a sound of surprise that is not part of a sound of either joy or sorrow?" With his energies were spent, although Loveday remained seated in the study from early morning until daylight began to fade, she had not 10 sentences to show for her day's work of assignation. Loveday and all spent only 2 clear days at Troyte's Hill. On the evening of the first of those days, Detective Griffiths received, through the trustworthy postboy, the following brief note from her. "I've found out that Hales owned Sandy close upon £100, which he had borrowed at various times. I don't know whether you will think this fact of importance. L.B." Mr. Griffiths repeated the last sentence blankly. "If Harry Craven were put upon his defense, his counsel, I take it, would consider the facts as first importance," he muttered. And in the remainder of the day, Mrs. Griffiths went about his work in a perturbed state of mind, doubtful whether to hold on or let go of the theory concerning Harry Craven's guilt. The next morning there came another brief note from Loveday, which ran thus. "As a matter of collateral interest, find out if a person calling himself Harold Cousins sailed 2 days ago from London docks for Natal and the Bonnie Dundee." To this massive Loveday received, in response, the following somewhat lengthy dispatch. "I did not quite see the drift of your last note, but have wired to our agents in London to carry out its suggestion. On my part, I have important news to communicate. I found out that Harry Craven's business out of doors on that night of the murder. At my instance, a warrant has been issued for his arrest. This warrant, it will be my duty to serve him in the course of today. Things are beginning to look very black against him, and I am convinced his illness is a sham. I have seen Walters, the man who is supposed to be attending him, and have driven him into the corner to make him admit that he has only seen young Craven once, on the first day of his illness, and that he gave his certificate entirely on the strength of what Mrs. Craven told him of her son's condition. On the occasion of this, his first and only visit, the lady, it seems, also told him that it would not be necessary for him to continue his attendance, as she felt herself competent to treat the case, having had so much experience in fever cases among the blacks of Natal. As I left Walter's house, the electricity of this important information, I was accosted by a man who keeps a low-class inn at the place, McQueen by name. He said that he wished to speak to me on a matter of importance. To make a long story short, this McQueen stated that on the night of the 6th, shortly after 11 o'clock, Harry Craven came to his house bringing with him a valuable piece of plate, a handsome epergne, and requested him to lend him £100 on it, and he hadn't a penny in his pocket. McQueen complied with this request to the extent of 10 sovereigns, and now, in the fit of a nervous terror, comes to me to confess himself a receiver of stolen goods and play the honest man. He says he noticed that the young gentleman was very much agitated as he made the request, and he also begged him to mention his visit to no one. Now I am curious to learn how Master Harry will get over the fact that he passed the lodge at the hour at which the murder was most probably committed, and how he will get out of the dilemma of having repassed the lodge on his way back to the house, and not notice the wide-open window with the full moon shining down on it. Another word, keep out of the way when I arrive at the house, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, to serve the warrant. I do not wish your professional capacity to get wind, for you will not likely be yet of some use in the house. S3. Loveday read this note, seated at Mr. Craven's writing table, with the old gentleman himself reclining motionless beside her in his easy-chair. A little smile played about the corners of her mouth as she read over the words again. For you will most likely yet be of some use to us in the house. Loveday's second day in Mr. Craven's study promised to be as unfruitful as the first. For fully an hour after she had received Mr. Griffith's note, she sat at the writing table with her pen in hand, ready to transcribe Mr. Craven's inspirations. Beyond, however, the phrase muttered with closed eyes, "It's all here in my brain, but I can't put it into words." Not a half-syllable escaped his lips. At the end of the hour, the sound of footsteps on the outside gravel made her turn her head towards the windows. It was Griffiths approaching with 2 constables. She heard the hall door opened to admit them, but beyond that, not a sound reached her ear, and she realized how fully she was cut off from the communications of the rest of the household at the farther end of the unoccupied wing. Mr. Craven, still reclining in a semi-trance, evidently had not the faintest suspicion that so important an event as the arrest of his son on the charge of murder was about to be enacted in his house. Meanwhile, Griffiths and his constables had mounted the stairs leading to the north wing, and were being guided through the corridors to the sick room by the flying figure of Moggy, the maid. "Mistress!" cried the girl. "There are 3 men coming up the stairs, policemen every one of them. You come to ask what you want." Outside the door of the sick room stood Mrs. Craven, a tall, sharp-featured woman with sandy hair, growing rapidly gray. "What is the meaning of this? What is your business here?" she said hotly, addressing Griffiths, who headed to the party. Griffiths respectfully explained that the business was, and requested her to stand on one side that he might enter her son's room. "This is my daughter's room. Satisfy yourself of the fact," said the lady, throwing her back against the door as she spoke. And Griffiths and his confreres entered, to find Miss Craven, looking very white and scared, seated beside the fire in a long flowing robe of chamber. Griffiths departed in haste and confusion, without the chance of professional talk with Loveday. That afternoon saw him telegraphing wildly in all directions and dispatching messengers in all quarters. Finally he spent over a half-hour of the elaborate point to the chief of Newcastle, assuring him to the identity of one Harold Cousins, who had sailed the Bonnie Dundee for Natal with Harry Craven of Troyte's Hill, and advising that the police authorities in that faraway district should be immediately communicated with. The ink had not dried on the pen with the reports was written before the note, and Loveday's writing was put into his hand. Loveday evidently had had some difficulties in finding a messenger for this note, for it was brought to the gardener's boy, who informed Griffiths that the lady had said he would receive gold sovereign if he delivered the letter all right. Griffiths paid the boy and dismissed him, then proceeded to read Loveday's communication. It was written hurriedly, in pencil, and it ran as follows. Things are getting critical here. Directly you receive this, come up to the house with 2 of your men and post yourselves anywhere on the grounds where you can see and not be seen. There will be no difficulty in this, for it will be dark by the time you get here and are able to be here. I am not sure whether I shall want you to aid tonight, and you had better keep to the grounds until morning in case of need. But above all, never once lose sight of the study windows. This is underscored. If I put a lamp with green shade in one of those windows, do not lose a moment in entering by that window, which I will contrive to keep unlocked. Detective Griffiths rubbed his forehead, rubbed his eyes, and then he finished reading this. Well, I dare say it's all right, she said, but I'm bothered. That's all of it. And for the life of me, I can't see one step of the way she's going. He looked at his watch. The hands pointed at the 6:15, and the short September day was rapidly drawing to a close. A good 5 miles lay between him and Troyte's Hill, and there was evidently not a moment to lose. At the very moment that Griffiths with 2 constables were once more staring at the Grenfell High Road, behind the best horse they could procure, Mr. Craven was rousing himself from his long slumber and beginning to look round him. That slumber, however, though long, had not been a peaceful one, and it was sundry of the old gentleman's muttered exclamations that he stared uneasy in his sleep that had caused Loveday to pin, and then to creep out of the room to dispatch her hurried note. What event in the occurrence in the morning had had upon the household generally, Loveday, in her isolated corner of the house, had no means of ascertaining. She only noted that when Hales brought her tea, and he did precisely at 5 o'clock, he wore a particularly ill-tempered expression of countenance, and she heard him mutter as he set down the tea-tray that something about being a respectable man and not used to such goings-on. It was not until nearly an hour and a half after this that Mr. Craven had awakened with a sudden start, and looking wildly about him had questioned Loveday, who had entered the room. Loveday explained that the butler had brought in lunch at 1 and tea at 5, but since no one had come in. That's false, said Mr. Craven, with a sharp, unusual sort of tone. I saw him sneaking around the room, the whining, canting hypocrite, and you must have seen him too. Did you hear him say in a squeaky voice, Master, I know your secret? He broke off abruptly, looking wildly about. What's this? He entered. No, it's all wrong, Sandy's dead. He buried. They held an inquest on him, and he was praised up as if he were a saint. He must have had a bad man, that old Sandy, said Loveday sympathetically. You're right, cried Mr. Creeves, springing up excitedly from his chair and seizing her by the hand. If ever a man deserved death, he did. For 30 years he held that rod over my head, and then, where is I? He put his hand to his head and again sank, as if exhausted, into his chair. I suppose it is some sort of early indiscretion of yours in college that he knew of, said Loveday, eager to get to as much of the truth as possible while the mood for conference held sway in the feeble brain. That was it. I was a fool enough to marry a disreputable girl, a barmaid in the town, and Sandy was present at the wedding then, and... Here his eyes closed again, and his mutterings became incoherent. For 10 minutes he lay back in his chair, muttering this. A yelp, a groan, were the only words Loveday could distinguish among those mutterings, and then suddenly, slowly, and distinctly, he said, as if answering some plainly put question, A good blow with the hammer, and a good thing was done. I should like amazingly to see that hammer, said Loveday. Do you keep it anywhere at hand? His eyes opened with a wild, cunning look at them. Who was talking about a hammer? I didn't say I had one. If anyone says I did it with a hammer, they're telling me a lie. You've spoken to me about the hammer 2 or 3 times, said Loveday calmly. The one that killed your dog, Captain, and I should like to see it. That's all. A look of cunning died out of the old man's eyes. Poor Captain. Splendid dog, that. Oh, now, where are we? Where did we leave off? I remember it. It was elemental sounds of speech that what bothered me last night. Were you here then? No, I remember. I've been trying all day to assimilate a dog's yelp of pain to a human groan, and I couldn't have done it. The idea haunted me. Followed me wherever I went. If they both sound elementally similar, they must have something in common, but the link between them I could not find. Then it occurred to me, would a well-bred, well-trained dog like my captain in the stables there, at the moment of death, give an unmitigated, cherished yelp? Or would there be something of a human note of his death cry? The thing was worth putting to a test, and I could hand me down the treatise, a fragment on the fact of the matter. It would be worth 12 dogs' lives. So I went out into the moonlight. But you know all about it now, don't you? Yes, poor Captain. Did he yelp or groan? Well, he gave a loud, long, hideous yelp, just as one had done a common cur. I might have just as well done them alone. And only since that other brute opened his window and spying out on me, and saying in his cracked old voice, Master, what are you doing out here at the time of night? Again, he sank back in his chair, muttering incoherently with half-closed eyes. Loveday let him alone for a minute or so. Then she had another question to ask. And that other brute, did he yelp or groan when you dealt him his blow? What, old Sandy the brute? He fell back. I remember you said you would like to see the hammer that stopped him babbling his old tongue now, didn't you? He rose a little unsteady from his chair and seemed to drag his long limbs with an effort across the room to the cabinets at the farther end. Opening a drawer in his cabinet, he produced, from the midst some specimens of strata and fossils, a large-sized geological hammer. He brandished it for a moment over his head, then paused with his finger on his lip. Hush, he said. We shall have the fools creeping in to peep at us if we don't take care. And to Loveday's horror, he suddenly made to the back door, turned the lock on the key and withdrew it, and put it in his pocket. She looked at the clock. The hands were pointed at 7:30. Had Griffiths received her note at the proper time, and were the men on the grounds now? She could only pray that they were. Light is too strong for my eyes, she said, rising from her chair, and lifted the green-shaded lamp and placed it on a table that stood at the window. Oh, no, that won't do, said Mr. Craven. That would show everyone outside what we're doing. He crossed to the window and spoke, and removed the lamp thence to the mantelpiece. Loveday could only hope that in the few seconds that it remained in the window, that it had caught the eye of the outside watchers. The old man beckoned to Loveday to come near and examine the deadly weapon. Give it a good swing around, he said, suiting the action to the word, and down it came with a splendid crash. He brought the hammer within an inch of Loveday's forehead. She started back. Ha ha ha! He laughed harshly and unnaturally, with the light of a madman dancing in his eyes now. Did I frighten you? I wonder what sort of sounds you would make if I would give you a little tap there. Here he lightly touched her forehead with a hammer. Elemental, of course, it would be, and... Loveday steadied her nerves with a difficulty. Locked in with the lunatic, her only chance lay in the gaining time for the detectives to reach the house and enter through the window. Wait a minute, she said, striving to divert his attention. You've not yet told me what sort of elemental sound old Sandy made when he fell. But give me a pen and ink, I'll write down the full account of it all for you, and you can incorporate it afterwards in your treatise. For a moment, a look of real pleasure flitted across the old man's face and then faded. The brute fell back without a sound, he answered. It was all for nothing. That night's work, and not yet altogether for nothing. Now, I don't mind owning I would do it all over again to get the wild thrill and joy at my heart that I would when I looked down at the old man's dead face and felt myself free at last. Free at last! His voice rang out excitedly. Once more he brought his hammer around with an ugly swing. For a moment I was a young man again. I leaped into his room, and the moon was shining full with strength in the window. I thought of my old college days, and the fun we used to have at Pembroke. Topsy-turvy, I turned to everything. He broke off abruptly, and drew a step nearer to Loveday. The pity of it all was, he said suddenly, dropping the high, excited tone to a low, pathetic one, that he fell without a sound of any sort. And then he drew another step nearer. I wonder, he said, then broke off again and came close to Loveday's side. It was only a moment it occurred to me, he said, now that his lips rose to Loveday's ear, that a woman in her death agony would be much more likely to give utterance to an elemental sound than a man. He raised his hammer, and Loveday fled to the window, and was lifted from the outside by 3 pairs of strong arms. I thought I was conducting my very last case. I never had such a narrow escape before, said Loveday, as she stood talking to Mr. Griffiths on the Grenville platform, awaiting the train to carry her back to London. It seems strange that no one before suspected the old gentleman's sanity. I suppose, however, people were so used to his eccentricities that they did not notice how they were deepened into positive lunacy. His cunning evidently stood him in good stead in the inquest. It is possible, said Griffiths thoughtfully, that he did not absolutely cross the very slender line that divides eccentricity from madness until the murder. The excitement consequent upon the discovery of the crime may just have pushed him over the board. Now, Miss Brooke, we have exactly 10 minutes before your train comes. I should feel greatly obliged to you if you would explain 1 or 2 things that have professional interest to me. With pleasure, said Loveday. Put your questions into categorical order, and I will answer them. Well, then, in the first place, what suggested to your mind the old man's guilt? The relations that subsided between him and Sandy seemed to me to savor too much of fear than of one side, and on power on the other. Also, the income paid to Sandy during Mr. Craven's absence in Natal before, to my mind, an unpleasant resemblance to hush money. Poor wretched thing, and I hear that, after all, the women he married in the wild young days died soon after to the drink. I have no doubt, however, that Sandy sedulously kept one in fiction of his existence, even after his master's second marriage. Now, for another question, how was it that you knew Miss Craven had taken her brother's place in the sick room? On the evening of my arrival, I discovered a rather long pair of fair hair in an unswept fireplace in my room, which, as it happened, was usually occupied by Miss Craven. It had once occurred to me that the young lady had been cutting off her hair, and that there must be some powerful motive to induce such a sacrifice. The suspicious circumstances attending her brother's illness soon supplied me with such a motive. The typhoid fever business was very cleverly done. Not a servant in the house, I verily believe, and who would have thought Master Harry was upstairs ill, and Miss Craven away at her friends in Newcastle? The young fellow must have got clear to start off in the hour of the murder. His sister sent away the next day to Newcastle, dismissed her maid there, as here, and on the plea of no accommodation at her friend's house. Sent the girl to her own home on holiday, and treated herself to Troyte Hill in the middle of the night, having walked the 5 miles to Grenville. No doubt her mother admitted her through one of those easily opened front windows, and cut her hair, and put her to bed to impersonate her brother without delay. With Miss Craven's strong likeness to Mr. Harry, and the darkness of the room, it was easy to understand that the eyes of the doctor, personally unacquainted with the family, might easily be deceived. Now, Miss Brooke, you must admit that, with all this elaborate chicanery and double dealings going on, it was only natural that my suspicions should set strongly in that quarter. I read it all in another light, you see, said Loveday. It seemed to me that the mother, knowing her son's evil proclivities, believed in his guilt, in spite, possibly, of his assertions of innocence. The son, most likely, on his way back to the house after pledging the family plate, had met old Mr. Craven with a hammer in his hand. Seeing no doubt how impossible it would be for him to clear himself without incriminating his father, he preferred a flight to Natal and giving evidence in the inquest. Now, about this alias, said Mr. Griffiths briskly, for the train had a moment streaked into the station. "How did you know that Harold Cousins was identical to Harry Craven, and had sailed upon the Bonnie Dundee?" "Oh, that was easy enough," said Loveday as she stepped onto the train. "A newspaper sent down to Mr. Craven by his wife was forwarded as to direct his attention to the shipping list. In it I saw that the Bonnie Dundee had sailed 2 days previously for Natal. Now, it was only natural to connect Natal with Mrs. Craven, who had passed the greater part of her life there. It was easy to understand her wish to get her scapegrace son among her earlier friends. The alias under which she had sailed came already enough to light. I found it scribbled over one of Mr. Craven's writing pads in the study. Evidently it had been drummed into his ears by his wife of his son's alias, and the old gentleman was taken with his method of fixing it to memory. We'll hope that the young fellow under his new name will make new reputation for himself. At any rate, he'll have a better chance of doing so with the ocean between him and his evil companions. Now, it's goodbye, I think." "No," said Mr. Griffiths. "It is au revoir, for you will have to come back again for the assizes, and give the evidence that will shut old Mr. Craven in an asylum for the rest of his life." All right, well. Old man was nuts. I like these because they're a lot harder to solve than the other ones I've been reading. Did anyone else get it? I mean, anyone being able to get in and out of the house, I could see. But the fact he wanted to hear the sound difference between a dying dog and a dying man. That's just craziness. Ouch. Definitely go stretching. Man, that story took me a long time. But I said I was going to try to do 2 stories. And of course, the second story is a different author, different subject altogether. This one's actually written by a doctor. Stories from the Diary of a Doctor by L.T. Mead and Clifton Halifax, M.D. An Oak Coffin. On a certain cold morning in early spring, I was visited by 2 ladies, a mother and a daughter. The mother was dressed as a widow. She was a tall, striking-looking woman with full, wide-open dark eyes, and a mass of rich hair turned back with a white and noble brow. Her lips were firm, her features well-formed. She seemed to have plenty of character, but the deep lines of sadness under her eyes and round her lips were very remarkable. The daughter was a girl of 14, slim and weediness. Her eyes were dark like her mother's, but she had an abundance of tawny brown and very handsome hair. It hung down her back below her waist and floated over her shoulders. She was dressed, like her mother, in heavy mourning, and round her young mouth and dark, deep eyes there lingered the same inexpressible sadness. I motioned my visitors to chairs, and waited as usual to learn the reason of their favoring me with a call. "My name is Heathcote," said the older lady. "I've lately lost my husband, and I've come to you on account of my daughter. She is not well." I glanced again attentively at the young girl. I saw that she looked overstrained and nervous. Her restlessness, too, was apparent, so that she could scarcely sit still, and cracking up a paper knife which stood at the table near, she began twirling rapidly between her fingers and thumb. "It does me good to fidget with something," she said, glancing apologetically at her mother. "What are your daughter's symptoms?" I asked. Mrs. Heathcote began to describe them in the vague way which characterizes from a certain class of patient. I gathered at last from her words that Gabrielle would not eat. She slept badly, she was weak and depressed, and she took no interest in anything. "How old is Miss Gabrielle?" I asked. "She will be 15 her next birthday," replied her mother. All the while Mrs. Heathcote was speaking, the young daughter kept her eyes fixed on the carpet and still twirled the paper knife, and once or twice she yawned profoundly. I asked her to prepare for the usual medical examination. She complied without elasticity, and with a look on her face which she said plainly, "Young as I am, I know how useful and useless it is to fuss at all. I only submit because I must." I felt her pulse and sounded her heart and lungs. The action of her heart was a little weak, but the young's were perfectly healthy. In short, beyond a general physical and mental debility, I could find nothing whatsoever matter with the girl. After a time, I rang the bell to desire my servant to take Miss Heathcote into another room in order that I might speak to her mother alone. The young lady went away very unwillingly. The skeptical expression on her face was more apparent than ever. "You'll be sure to tell me all the exact truth," said Mrs. Heathcote, as soon as we were all alone. "I have very little to tell," I replied. "I have examined your daughter carefully. She is suffering from no disease to which a name can be attached. She is below par, certainly, but there is weakness and general depression. But a tonic might set all these matters right." "I've tried tonics without avail," said Mrs. Heathcote. "Has your family physician not seen Mrs. Heathcote?" "Not lately." The widow's manner became decidedly hesitating. "And fact is, we have not consulted him since Mr. Heathcote's death," she said. "When did that take place?" 6 months ago." Here she spoke with an infinite sadness, and her face, already very pale, turned perceptibly paler. "Is there nothing you can tell me to give me a clue of your daughter's... Is there nothing you can tell me to give me a clue of your daughter's condition? Is there anything, for instance, preying on her mind?" "Nothing whatsoever." The expression on her face was very sad for so young a girl. "You must remember," said Mrs. Heathcote, "that she recently has lost her father." "Even so," I replied, "that would scarcely account for a nervous condition, and a healthy-minded child will not be overcome with grief to the serious detriment of health after an interval of 6 months, at least," I added. "That is my experience in ordinary cases." "I'm grieved to hear it," said Mrs. Heathcote. She looked very much troubled. Her agitation was apparent in the trembling hands and quivering lips. "Your daughter is in a nervous condition," I said, rising. "She has no disease at present, but a little extra strain might develop real disease, or it might affect her nerves, already overstrung, to a dangerous degree. I should recommend complete change of air and scenery immediately." Mrs. Heathcote sighed heavily. "You don't look very well yourself," I said, giving her a keen glance. She flushed crimson. "I've felt my sorrow accurately," she said. I made a few more general remarks, wrote a prescription for the daughter, and bade Mrs. Heathcote goodbye. About the same hour on the following morning, I was astonished when my servant brought me a card on which was scribbled in pencil the name Gabrielle Heathcote, and underneath, in the same upright but unformed hand, the words, "I want to see you most urgently." A few moments later, Miss Gabrielle was standing in my room Her appearance was much the same as yesterday, except now that her face was eager, watchful, and awake. "How do you do?" she said, holding out her hand and blushing. "I've ventured to come alone. I haven't brought a fee. Does that matter?" "Not at the least," I replied. "Pray, sit down and tell me what you want." "I'd rather stand," she answered. "I feel too restless and excited to sit still. I stole away from home without letting Mother know. I liked your look yesterday and determined to see you again. Now, may I confide in you?" "You certainly may," I replied. My interest in this queer child was a good deal aroused. I felt certain that I was right in my conjectures of yesterday, and that this young creature had really burdens with some secrets that was gravely undermining her own health. "I am willing to listen to you," I continued. "You must be brief, of course, for I am a very busy man, but anything you can say which will throw light into your own condition, and so help me cure you, will, of course, be welcome." "You think me very nervous," said Miss Gabrielle. "Your nerves are out of order." "Yes, I know that. I don't sleep at night." "Yes?" Miss Gabrielle looked towards the door. "Is it shut?" she asked excitedly. "Of course it is." She came close to me. Her voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. Her face turned not only gray or white, but gray. "I can stand it no longer," she said. "I'll tell you the truth. You wouldn't sleep either if you were me. My father isn't dead." "Nonsense," I replied. "You must control such imaginings, Miss Gabrielle, or you can really get into a very unhealthy condition of your mind." "That's what Mother says when I speak to her," replied the child. "But I tell you this is true. My father is not dead. I know it." "How can you possibly know it?" I asked. "I've seen him. There." "You have seen your father, but he died 6 months ago." "Yes, he died and was buried, and I went to his funeral, but all the same, he is not dead now." "My dear young lady," I said, as in a soothing tone as I could assume, "you are the victim of what is called a hallucination. You have felt your father's death very acutely." "I have. I loved him beyond words. He was so kind, so affectionate, and so good to me. It almost broke my heart when he died. I thought I could never be happy again. Mother was as wretched as myself. There weren't two more miserable people in the wide world. It seemed impossible to either of us to smile and be cheerful again. I began to sleep badly, for I cried so much. My eyes ached, and I did not care much for lessons any more." "All those feelings will pass," I replied. "They are natural, but some time will abate their violence." "You think so?" said the girl with a strange smile. "Now let me go on with my story. It was Christmas time when I first saw my father. We lived in an old house in Brixton. It was a walled-in garden. I was standing by my window about midnight. I had been in bed for an hour or more, but I could not sleep. The house was perfectly quiet. I got out of bed and went to the window and drew up the blind. I stood by the window and looked out into the garden, which was covered with snow. There, standing under the window, with his arms folded, was Father. He stood perfectly still and turned his head slowly, first in the direction of my room and then in that of my mother's. He stood there for quite 5 minutes and then walked across the grass into the shelter of a shrubbery. I put on a cloak and rushed downstairs. I unbolted the front door and went into the garden. I shouted my father's name and ran into the shrubbery to look for him, but he wasn't there. And I think I fainted. When I came to myself, I was in bed and Mother was bending over me. Her face was all blistered as if she had been crying terribly. I told her what I had just seen Father, and she said it was just a dream." "So it was," I replied. Miss Gabrielle's dark brows were knit in some pain. "I did not think you would take that commonplace view," she responded. "I'm sorry if I've offended you," I answered. "Girls like you do have bad dreams when they're in trouble, and those dreams are often so vivid that they mistake them for realities." "Very well, then. I've had more of those dreams. I've seen my father again. The last time I saw him, he was in the house. It was about a month ago. As usual, I could not sleep. I went downstairs quite late to get a second volume of the novel which interested me. There was Father walking across the passage. His back was to me. He opened the study door and went in, and he shut it behind him.
I rushed to it in order to open it and followed him, but it was locked, and though I screamed through the keyhole, no one replied to me. Mother found me kneeling by the study door and shouting through the keyhole to Father. She was up and dressed, which seemed strange at so late an hour. She took me upstairs and put me to bed and pretended to be angry with me, but when I told her that I had seen Father, she burst into the most awful bitter tears and said, "Oh, Gabrielle, he is dead, dead, quite dead."
Then he comes here from the dead, I said.
No, no, he's not dead. I've just seen him. My poor child, said Mother. I must take you to a good doctor without delay. You must not get this thing on in your brain. Very well, I replied. But I am quite willing to see Dr. Mackenzie.
I interrupted the narrative to inquire who Dr. Mackenzie was.
He is a family physician, replied the young lady. He has attended us for years.
And what did your mother say when you proposed to see him?
She shivered violently and said, "No, I won't have him in my house." After a time, she decided to bring me to you.
And have you had that hallucination again? I inquired.
It was not a hallucination, she answered, pouting her lips.
I will humor you, I answered. Have you seen your father again?
No, and I'm likely not to.
Why do you think that?
I cannot quite tell you. I think Mother's in it. Mother is very unhappy about something, and she looks at me at times as if she were afraid of me.
Here Miss Heathcote rose.
I said I was not to stay long, she remarked. Now I have told you everything. You see that it is absolutely impossible for ordinary medicines to cure me, any more than ordinary medicines can cure my mother of her awful dreams.
I did not know that your mother dreamt badly, I said.
She does so, but she doesn't speak of it. She dreams so badly she cries out terribly in her sleep, and that she has moved from her old bedroom next to mine to one of the distant wing of the house. Poor mother, I'm sorry for her, but I'm glad at least to have the courage to tell you what I've seen. You will make it your business to find out the truth now, won't you?
What do you mean? I asked.
Why, of course. My father's alive, she retorted. You've got to prove that he is, and to give him back to me again. I leave the matter in your hands. I know you're wise and very clever. Goodbye, goodbye.
The queer girl left me, tears rolling down her cheeks. I was obliged to attend to other patients, but it was impossible for me to get Miss Heathcote's story out of my head. There was no doubt whatsoever that she was telling the truth, what she firmly believed to be the truth. She had either seen her father once more in the flesh, or she was a victim of a very strong hallucination. In all probability, the latter supposition was the correct one. A man could not die and have a funeral and yet still be alive. But then, on the other hand, when Miss Heathcote brought Gabrielle to see me yesterday, she had not mentioned the central principal figure of her malady. Mrs. Heathcote had said nothing whatsoever in regard to Gabrielle's delusions. Then why was the mother so nervous? Why did she say nothing about her own bad dreams, dreams so disturbing that she was obliged to change her bedroom in order that her daughter should not hear her screams?
I leave the matter in your hands, Miss Heathcote had said.
Poor child. She had done so with a vengeance. I could not get the story out of my thoughts, so uncomfortable did the whole thing make me that I determined to pay a visit to Dr. Mackenzie. Mackenzie was a physician in a very large practice in Brixton. His name was already familiar to me. On one or two occasions I had met him in consultation. I looked up his address in the medical directory, and that very evening I took a hansom to his house. He happened to be at home. I sent my card and was admitted at once. Mackenzie received me in his consulting room, and I was not long for explaining the motive of my visit. After a few preliminary remarks, I said that I would be glad if he would favor me with the particulars in regard to Heathcote's death. I can easily do that, said Mackenzie. The case was a perfectly straightforward one. My patient was consumptive, had been for years, and he
died in the last of hypothesis.
What aged man was he? I asked.
Oh, not old, a little past 40. Tall, slight, good-looking man with a somewhat emaciated face. In short, he was an ordinary case of consumption.
I told Mackenzie all about the visit which I had received from Mrs. Heathcote, and gave him a more faithful version of the strange story which Miss Gabrielle Heathcote had told me that day.
Miss Gabrielle is an excitable girl, replied the doctor. I've had a good deal to do with her for many years, and always thought of her nerves highly strung. She is evidently the victim of delusion caused by the effect of grief in somewhat delicate organism. She probably inherits her father's disease. Mrs. Heathcote should take her from home immediately.
Mrs. Heathcote looks as if she needs a change of almost as badly as her daughter, I answered. But now, you will forgive me if I ask a few more questions. Will you oblige me by describing Heathcote's death as faithfully as you can?
Certainly, replied the physician.
He sank down into the chair on the opposite side of the hearth as we spoke.
The death, when it came, he continued, was, I must confess, unexpected. I'd sounded Heathcote's lungs about 3 months prior to the time of his death and seizure. Physicist was present, but not to an advanced degree. I recommended his wintering abroad. He was a solicitor by profession and had a good practice. I remember his asking me, with a comical rise of his brows, how he was to carry on his profession so many miles from Chancery Lane. But to come to his death, it took place 6 months ago, at the beginning of September. It had been a hot season, and I had just returned from my past holiday. My portmanteau and Gladstone bag had been placed in the hall, and I was paying the cableman's fare when the servant came from Heathcote arrived and begged me to go immediately to her master, who she said, was dying. I hurried off to the house without a moment's delay. It's a stone's throw from here. In fact, you can see the walls of the garden from this window in this room in the daytime. I reached the house. Gabrielle was standing in the hall, and I am an old friend of hers. Her face was quite white and had a stunned expression. When she saw me, she rushed to me and clasped one of my hands in both of hers and burst into tears. "Go and save him!" she gasped, her voice choking with sobs, which were almost hysterical. A lady who happened to be staying at the house came and drew the girl away into one of the sitting rooms, and I went upstairs. I found Heathcote in his own room. He was lying on the bed. It was a ghastly sight. His face wore a sick hue of death itself. His sweet hair and even his face were covered with blood. His wife was standing over him, wiping away the blood which oozed from his lips. I saw, of course, immediately what was the matter. Hemotyphus had set in, and I felt that his hours were numbered. "He has broken a blood vessel," exclaimed Miss Heathcote. He was standing here preparing to go down to dinner when he coughed violently and blood began to pour from his mouth. I got him on the bed and sent for you. The hemorrhage seems to be a little less violent now. I examined my patient carefully, feeling his pulse, which was very weak and low. I cautioned him not to speak a single word, and asked Mrs. Heathcote to send for some ice immediately, which she did. I packed him in ice and gave him a dose of ergogen. He seemed easier, and I left him, presuming to work again in an hour or two. Miss Gabrielle met me in the hall as I went out. "Is he any better? Is there hope at all?" she asked as I left the house. "Your father is easier now," I replied. "The hemorrhage has been arrested. I'm coming back soon. You must get a good girl and try to comfort your mother in every way in your power." "And there is no hope," she answered, looking me full in the face. I could not truthfully say that there was. I knew poor Heathcote's days were numbered, although I scarcely thought the end would come so quickly. "What do you mean?" I inquired. "Why, this," he replied. "Less than an hour before I got home, I received a brief note from Mrs. Heathcote, and it stated that the fresh and very violent hemorrhage had set in almost immediately after I left, and that her husband was dead." "And," I continued, "well, that is the story. Poor Heathcote had died of hemotyphus." "Did you see the body after death?" I inquired after a pause. No, it was absolutely unnecessary. The cause of death was so evident. I attended the funeral, though. Heathcote was buried in Kensington Green. I made no comment for a moment or two. I'm sorry you did not see the body after death, I said after a pause. My remark seemed to irritate Mackenzie. He looked at me with raised eyebrows. Would you have thought it necessary to do so? He asked. A man known to be consumptive dies of violent hemorrhage of his lungs. The family are in great trouble. There is much besides to think of. Would you, under any circumstances, have considered it necessary to refuse to give a certificate without seeing the body? I thought for a moment. I always make a rule about seeing the body, I replied, but of course you are justified as the law stands. Well then, there is no doubt Heathcote is really dead. Really dead, retorted Mackenzie. Don't you understand that he has been in his grave for 6 months, that I particularly saw him die? And I attended his funeral. By the possible chance, can the man be alive? None, I replied. He is dead, of course. I'm sorry for the poor girl. She ought to leave home immediately. Girls of her age often have delusions, said Mackenzie. I have no doubt this will pass in time. I'm surprised, however, that the Heathcotes allowed to bring the thing so long. I remember now that they have never been near the house since the funeral. I never understand they're not calling any in. That fact puzzles me as well, I said. They came to me, a total stranger, instead of consulting their family physician, and Mrs. Heathcote carefully concealed the most important part of his daughter's malady. It is strange altogether, and although I can give no explanation whatsoever, I am convinced that there is one if we could only get to it. One more question before I go, Mackenzie. You spoke of Heathcote as a solicitor. Has he left his family well off? They're not rich, replied Mackenzie, but as far as I can tell, they don't seem to be in want for money. I believe their house, Ivy Hall was its name, belongs to them. They live there very quietly, with a couple maids, servants. I should say they belong to the well-to-do middle class. Then money troubles cannot explain the mystery, I replied. Believe me, there is no mystery, answered Mackenzie in an annoyed voice. I held out my hand to wish him goodbye, when a loud peal from the front door startled us both. If ever there was a frantic haste in anything, there was the ringing peal. Someone wants you in a hurry, I said to the doctor. He was about to reply when the door of the consulting room was flung wide open and Gabrielle Heathcote rushed into the room. Mother is very ill, she exclaimed. I think she is out of her mind. Come to her at once. She took Mackenzie's hand in hers. There isn't a minute to lose, she said. She may kill herself. She came to me with a carving knife in her hand. I rushed away at you at once. 2 servants are here with me now. And they're doing all they can, but, oh, pray, do come quick. At this moment, Gabrielle's eyes rested on me. A look of relief and almost ecstasy passed over her poor thin little face. You are here, she exclaimed. You will come too. Oh, how glad I am. If Dr. Mackenzie will permit me, I replied, I shall be only too pleased to accompany him. By all means, come. You may be the greatest use, he answered. We started at once. As soon as we left the house, Gabrielle rushed from us. I'm going to have the front door open for both of you when you arrive, she exclaimed, and disappeared as if wings were in the wind. That is a good girl, I said, turning to the other doctor. She's always deep attached to both her parents, he answered. We did not either of us say another word until we got to Ivy Hall. It was a rambling old house with numerous lower rooms and a big entrance hall. I could fancy that in the summer it was cheerful enough with its large walked-in garden. The night was a dark one, but there was a moon presently. Gabrielle was waiting in the hall to receive us. I will take you to the door of my mother's room, she exclaimed. Her words came out trembling. Her face was like death. She was shaking all over. She ran up the stairs before us, and then down a long passage which led to a room in the little part, a rest away from the house. I told your mother wished to sleep in the room as far away from me as possible, she said, flashing a glance into my face as she spoke. I nodded in reply. We opened the door and went in. The sight which met our eyes was one which most medical men are familiar. The patient was lying on the bed in a state of violent delirium. The two maidservants were bending over her and evidently much exciting her feelings in their efforts to hold her down. I spoke at once with authority. You can leave the room now, I said. Only remain within call in case you are wanted. They obeyed instantly, looking at me with surprised glances, and at Mackenzie with the manifest relief. I shut the door after them and approached the bed. One glance showed me that Mrs. Heathcote was mad in the ordinary sense, but she was suffering from a moment of acute delirium. I put my hand on her forehead, and it burned with fever. Her pulse was rapid and uneven. Mackenzie took her temperature, which was very nearly 104 degrees. While we were examining her, she remained quiet, but presently we stood together and watched her, and she began to rave again.
What is it, Gabriel? No, he is quite dead, child. I tell you, I saw the men screw his coffin down. He is dead, quite dead. Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God, dead!
She sat up in bed and stared straight before her.
You mustn't come here so often,
she said, looking past us into the center of the room, and addressing someone whom she seemed to see with distinctness.
I tell you it isn't safe. Gabriel suspects. Don't come so often. I'll manage some other way. Trust me. Do trust me. You know I won't let you starve. Oh, go away. Go away.
She flung herself back to the bed and pressed her hands frantically to her burning eyes.
Your father's been dead 6 months now, Gabriel,
she said presently in a changed voice.
No one was ever more dead. I tell you, I saw him die. He was buried, and you went to his funeral. Here again
her voice altered. She sat upright with the motion in her hand.
Will you bring the coffin in here, please? Into this room? Yes, it seems a nice coffin. Well furnished. The coffin is made from oak. That is right, oak glass. You can't hear coffins that crumble away very quickly. This is a good one. You will have taken pains with it. I'm pleased. Lay him in gently. He's not very heavy, is he? You see how worn he is? Consumption, yes, consumption. He's been a long time dying, and at the end of his life, suddenly the hemorrhage of his lungs. We did it to save Gabriel, to keep away. What are you going to keep away? No, yes, dishonor. Look.
Here she burst into a loud laugh.
You don't suppose, you Undertaker's men, I'm going to tell you what you did with it. Dr. Mackenzie was there. We saw him just as the end. Now you placed him in nicely in his coffin and you can go. Thank you, you can go now. You don't want to see his face. Dead face is too scared. You must not look into it. He's peaceful, only pale, only pale. Only dead people look pale. That's pale as most dead people. Oh, I forgot. You can't see him. Are you cold? Oh, yes, I think quite so. You want to screw his coffin down? Of course. I was forgetting. Now, be quick about it. I was very nearly having him buried with the coffin open. Screw away now, screw away. Oh, how the noise grates on my nerves. I shall go mad if it were not quick. Do be quick, and leave me alone with my dead. Oh, God, with my dead.
The wretched woman's voice sank into a hoarse whisper. She struggled on her knees, and folding her hands, began to pray.
God in heaven, have mercy upon me and upon my dead, she moaned. Now, and where's the screwdriver? Oh, heavens, it's lost. We're undone. My God, what is the matter with me? My brain reels. Oh God, my God.
She moaned fearfully, laid her back on the bed. Her mutterings became more rapid and indistinct. Presently she slept. She must not be left in this condition, said Mackenzie to me. It would be very bad for Gabrielle to see her mother now, and those young servants are not to be trusted. I will go and send in a nurse as soon as possible. Can you do me the inestimable favor in remaining here until the nurse arrives? I was going to suppose that I should, in this case. Spend one night here, I replied. That is more than good of you, said the doctor. Not at all, I answered. The case interests me extremely. A moment or two later, Mackenzie left the house. During his absence, Mrs. Heathcote slept, and I sat and watched her. The fever raged very high. She muttered constantly her terrible dreams, but said nothing coherent. I felt very anxious about her. She had evidently been subject to a most frightful strain, and now all her nature was giving way. I dared not think that her words implied. My mission was at present to do what I could to relieve her. The nurse arrived around midnight. She was a sensible, middle-aged woman, very strong, too, and evidently accustomed to fever patients. I gave her some directions, desired her to ring a certain bell if she required any assistance. I left the room. As I went downstairs, I noticed the moon had risen. The house was perfectly still. The sick woman's moans could not be heard beyond the distant wing of the house where she slept. As I went downstairs, I remembered Gabriel's story about the moonlit garden and her father's figure standing there. I felt a momentary curiosity to see what the garden was like, and moving aside the blind, which concealed one of the lobby's windows, I looked out. I gave one hurried glance and started back. Was I, too, the victim of illusion? Standing in the garden was the tall figure of a man with folded arms. He was looking away from me, but the light fell on his face. It was cadaverous and ghastly white. His hat was off. He moved into a deep shadow. It was all done in an instant. He came and went like a flash. I pursued my way softly downstairs. This man's appearance seemed exactly to coincide with Mackenzie's description of Heathcote. But it was possible, in any of my wonderful possibilities on this earth, that a man could rise from his coffin and walk the earth again. Gabriel was waiting for me in the cheerful drawing room. A bright fire burned at the grate, and there were candles in brackets, and one or two shaped lamps placed on the small tables. On one table, a little larger than the rest, white cloth was spread. It also contained a tray with glasses, some claret, sherry, and decanters, and a plate of sandwiches.
"You must be tired," said Gabriel. "Please take a glass of wine and please eat something. I know those sandwiches are good. I made them myself."
She pressed me to eat and drink. In truth, I needed refreshments. The scene in the sick room had told even on my iron nerves, and the sight from the lobby window had almost taken my breath away. Gabrielle attended on me as if she were my daughter. I was touched by her solitude, and by the really noble way in which she tried to put herself out at night. At last she said, in a voice which shook with emotion,
I know, Dr. Halifax, that you think badly of my mother."
"Your mother's very ill indeed," I answered.
"It is good of you to come to help her. You are a great doctor, are you not?"
I smiled at the child's question. "I want to tell you something in the beginning of your mother's illness," I said after a pause. "When I saw her 2 days ago, she scarcely considered herself ill at all. In fact, you were supposed to be the patient." Gabrielle dropped into the nearest chair.
"There is a mystery somewhere," she said, "but I cannot make it out. When I came back after seeing you today, Mother seemed very restless and troubled. I thought she would have questioned me about being so long away, and asked me at least what I had done with myself. Instead of that, she asked me to tread softly. She said that she had such an intolerable headache that she could not endure the least sound. I saw that she had been out, and she had her walking boots on, and they were covered with mud. I tried to coax her to eat something, but she would not, and as I saw her she really wished to be alone, I left her. At tea time, our parlour maid, Peters, told me that Mother had gone to bed, and had given directions that she was on no account to be disturbed. I had tea alone, and then I came in here and made a place as bright as comfortable as I could. Once or twice before, since my father's death, Mother had suffered from acute headaches, and has gone to bed. But when they got better, she was dressed and come downstairs again. I thought she might like to do so tonight, and that she would be pleased to see a bright room and everything cheerful about her. I got a storybook and tried to read, but my thoughts were of my mother, and I felt dreadfully puzzled and anxious. The time seems very long, too. I wished heartily that the night were over. I went upstairs about 8 o'clock and listened outside Mother's door. She was moaning and talking to herself. It seemed to me that she was saying dreadful things. I quite shuddered as I listened. I knocked at the door, but there was no answer. Then I turned the handle and tried to enter, but the door was locked. I went downstairs again, and Peter asked if I would like supper. She was still in the room, and I had not made up my mind whether I could eat anything or not, when I heard her give a short scream. I turned around and saw Mother standing in the room with her nightdress. She had a carving knife in her hand. "Gabrielle," she said in a quiet voice, but with an awful look in her eyes, "I want to tell you the truth. Is there any blood on my hands?" No, Mother," I answered. She gave a deep sigh, and then looked at them as if she were Lady Macbeth. "Gabrielle," she said again, "I can't live any longer without your father. I've made this knife sharp. It won't take long." Then she turned and left the room. Peters ran for the cook, and they went upstairs after her, and I rushed for Dr. Mackenzie.
"It was a fearful ordeal for you," I said, "and you bravely handled it bravely. And you must not think too much about your mother's condition, nor about any words which she happens to say. She is highly feverish at present, and she is not accountable for her actions. Sit down now, please, and take a glass of wine yourself."
"No, thank you. I never take wine."
"I'm glad to hear you say that, for in case a glass of good claret will do wonders for you. Here, I'm going to pour you out one. Now drink it off at once." She obeyed me with a patient sort of smile. She was very pale, but the wine brought some color into her cheeks. "I'm interested in your story," I said after a pause, "particularly in what you have told me about your poor father. He must have been a very interesting man for you to treasure his memory so deeply. Do you mind describing him to me?" She flushed when I spoke up. I saw that there were tears very near her eyes, but she bit her lip to keep back emotion.
"My father was like no one else," she said. "It was impossible for me to make a picture of him for one who has not seen him."
"But you can at least tell me, was he tall or short, dark or fair, old or young?"
"No, I can't," she said after another pause. "He was just father. When you love your father, he has a kind of eternal youth, and you don't discriminate his features. If you are his only child, he is just the one face in all the world to you. I find it impossible to describe his face, although it fills my mind's eye, waking and sleeping. But stay, I have a picture of him. I don't show it to many, but you shall see it."
She rushed out of the room, returning in a moment with a morocco case. She opened it and brought over a candle in the same time, so that the light should fall upon the picture within. It represented a tall, slight man with deep-set eyes and a very thin face. The eyes were somewhat piercing in their glance. The lips were closely set and firm, and the chin was cleft. The face showed determination. I gave it a quick glance, and closing the case, returned it to Gabrielle. The face was the face of the man I had seen in the garden. My patient passed a dreadful night. She was no better the next morning. Her temperature was rather higher, her pulse quicker, and her respiration more hurried. Her ravings had now become almost incoherent. Mackenzie and I had another anxious consultation over her. When he left the house, I accompanied him. "I'm going to make a strange request of you," I said. "I wish for your assistance, and I'm sure you will not refuse to give it to me. In short, I want to make an immediate steps to have Heathcote's coffin opened." I'm quite sure Mackenzie thought that I was mad. He looked at me, opened his lips as if to speak, then waited to hear my next words. "I want to have Heathcote's body exhumed," I said. "If you'll listen to me, I will tell you why." Then I gave him a graphic account of the man I had seen in the garden.
There's foul play here somewhere, I said, in conclusion. I've been dragged into this thing almost against my will, and now I'm determined to see it through. Mackenzie flung up his hands. I don't pretend to doubt your wisdom, he said, but to ask me gravely to assist to exhume the body of a man who died of consumption 6 months ago, it's enough to take my breath away. What reason can you possibly give to the authorities of such an action? I have strong grounds for believing that the death never took place at all, I replied. Now, will you cooperate with me on this matter or not? Well, of course I'll cooperate with you, he answered, but I don't pretend to say that I like the business. We walked together to his house, talking things over the necessary steps which must be taken in order to get an exhumation. Mackenzie promised to telegraph to me as soon as ever this was obtained, and I was obliged to hurry off to attend to my own duties. As I was stepping into my hansom, I turned to ask the doctor one more question. Have you any reason to suppose Heathcote was heavily insured? I asked. No, I don't know anything about it, he answered. You're quite sure there's no money troubles at all? I do not know of any, but that fact amounts to nothing, for I was not really intimate with the family, and as I said yesterday evening, never entered the house until last night from the day of the funeral. I've never heard of money troubles, but, of course, they might have existed. As soon as ever I hear from you, I will make an agreement to meet you at Kensal Green, I replied, and then I jumped into the hansom and drove away. In the course of the day, I got the telegram acquainting me with Mrs. Heathcote's condition. I still remained absolutely unchanged, and there was, in Mackenzie's opinion, no necessity for me to pay her another visit. Early the next morning, the required order came from the coroner. Mackenzie wired and praised me of the fact, and I telegraphed back, making an appointment to meet him at Kensal Green on the following morning. I shall not soon forget that day. It was one of those blustering and intensely cold days that come oftener in March than any other time of year. The cemetery looked as dismal as such a place would be on the occasion. A few wreaths of flowers which were scattered here and there on newly made graves were sodden and deprived from all their frail beauty. The wind blew in great gusts, which were about every 10 minutes accompanied by showers of sleet. There was a hollow moaning noise distinctly audible in the intervals of the storm. I found, on my arrival, that Mackenzie was there before me. He was accompanied by one of the coroner's men and a police constable. 2 men were working on the cemetery also came forward to assist. No one expressed the least surprise at our strange errand. Around Mackenzie's lips alone, I read the expression of disapproval. Kensal Green is one of the oldest cemeteries which surround our vast metropolis, and one of the Heathcote's burying place was quite the oldest portion of the God's Acre. It was one of the hideous, ancient, rapidly going out of date vaults. A huge brick erection was placed over it, at one side, which was the door of the entrance. The earth was removed, and the door of the vault opened, and some of the men went down the steps, one of them holding a torch to order to identify the coffin. In a couple of minutes' time, it was borne into the light of day. When I saw it, I remembered poor Mrs. Heathcote's wild ravings. "A good, strong oak coffin, which wears well," she had exclaimed. Mackenzie and I, accompanied by the police constable and the coroner's man, followed the bearers of the coffin to the mortuary. As we were going there, I turned to ask Mackenzie how his patient was. He shook his head and answered me. "I fear the worst," he replied. "Mrs. Heathcote is very ill indeed." The fever rages high and is like a consuming fire. Her temperature was 105 this morning. Wow.
I should recommend packing her in sheets wrung out of cold water, I answered. Poor woman. How do you account for the sudden illness, Mackenzie? He shrugged his shoulders. Shock of some sort, he answered. And then he continued. If you really knew of this day's work, it would kill her off pretty quickly. Poor soul, he answered. I hope it may never reach your ears. We had now reached the mortuary. The men who had borne the coffin on their shoulders lowered it on a pair of tricycles. They then took turns screwdriver out of their pockets and, in a businesslike manner, and unscrewed the lid. After doing this, they left the mortuary, closing the door behind them. The moment we found ourselves alone, I said word to the police constable, and then, going quickly up to the coffin, lifted the lid. Under ordinary circumstances, such a proceeding would have been followed by appalling results, which need not here be described. Mackenzie, whose face was very white, stood near me. I looked at him for a moment, and then flung along the pall which was to conceal the face of the dead. The dead, truly. Here was death, which had never, in any case, known a life like ours. Mackenzie uttered a loud exclamation. The constable and the coroner's man came close and lifted a bag of flour out of the coffin. There were many similar bags here. It had been closely packed and evidently with a few counterfeits the exact weight of the dead man. Poor Mackenzie was absolutely speechless. The coroner's man began to take copious notes. The police constable gravely did the same. Mackenzie at last found his tongue. I never felt more stunned in my life, he said. Very truth, but I saw the man die. Where is he? In the name of heaven, what has become of him? This is the most monstrous thing I've ever heard in my whole course of my life. And I attended the funeral for those bags of flour. No wonder the woman never cared to see me inside the house again. But what puzzles me, he continued, is the motive. What can the motive be? Perhaps one of the insurance companies can tell us that, said the police officer. It is my duty to report this sort of thing. He continued, turning to me. I have not the least doubt that the Crown will prosecute. I cannot at all prevent your taking the steps that you think proper, I replied. Only pray understand that the poor lady who is the principal perpetrator in this fraud lies at the present moment at death's door. Well, you must get the man himself, remembered the police officer. If he is alive, we shall find him soon. Half an hour later, Mackenzie and I had left the dismal cemetery. I had to hurry back to Harley Street to attend some important duties, but I arranged to meet Mackenzie that evening at the Heathcote's house. I need not say that my thoughts were much occupied by Mrs. Heathcote and her miserable story. What a life that wretched Heathcote must have led during the last 6 months. No wonder he looked cadaverous in the moonlight as fell over his gaunt figure. No ghost truly was he, but a man of like flesh and blood to ourselves. A man who was supposed to be buried in Kensal Green, but yet who walked the earth. It was about 8 o'clock when I reached the Heathcote's house. Mackenzie had already arrived. He came to the hall to meet me. Where is Miss Gabrielle? I asked at once. Poor child, he replied. I have begged her to stay in her room. She knows nothing of what took place this morning, but is in a terrible state of grief about her mother. That unfortunate woman's hours are numbered. She is sinking fast. Will you come to her at once, Halifax? She has asked for you several times. I accompanied Mackenzie. I mounted the stairs and entered the sick room. One glance at the patient's face showed me all too plainly that I was at the chamber of death. Mrs. Heathcote lay perfectly motionless. Her bright hair, still the hair of quite a young woman, was flung back over the pillow. Her pale face was wet with perspiration. Her eyes, sullen, dark, and awful in expression, turned and fixed themselves on me as I approached the bedside. Something like the ghost of a smile quivered around her lips. She made an effort to stretch out her shadowy hand to grasp mine. Don't stir, I said to her. Perhaps you want to say something. I will stoop down to listen to you. I have very good hearing, so you can speak as low as you please. She smiled again with a sort of pleasure at understanding her.
I have something to confess, she said in a hollow whisper. Send the nurse and Dr. Mackenzie out of the room.
I was obliged to explain the dying woman's wishes to my brother physician. He called to the nurse to follow him, and they immediately left the room. As soon as they had done so, I bent my head to look at Mrs. Hennicott's hands in mine. Now, I said, take comfort. God can forgive sin. Have you sinned?
Oh, yes. But how can you possibly know?
Never mind. I'm a good judge of character. If speaking to me will relieve your conscience, speak.
My husband is alive, she murmured.
Yes, I said. I guessed as much.
He had insured his life, she continued, for about £15,000. The money was wanted to save us from dishonor. We managed to counterfeit death.
She stopped, as if unable to proceed any further.
A week ago, she continued, I saw the man who was supposed to be dead. He is really dying now. The strain of knowing that I could do nothing for him, horrible to comfort his last moments, was too horrible. I felt that I could not live without him. On the day of my illness, I took a poison, a preparation of Indian hemp. I meant to kill myself. I did not know that my object would be affected in so terrible a manner.
Here she looked towards the door. A great change came over her face. Her eyes shone with sudden brightness. A look of awful joy filled them. She made a frantic effort to raise herself in bed. I followed the direction of her eyes, and then, indeed, a startled exclamation passed my lips. Gabrielle, with her cheeks crimson, her lips tremulous, and her hair tossed wildly about her head and shoulders, was advancing into the room, leading a cadaverous, ghastly-looking man by the hand. In other words, Heathcote himself was in the flesh and had come to see his wife's dying chamber.
"Oh, Horace," she exclaimed. "Horace, to die in your arms, to know that you will soon join me. This is too much bliss. This is too much joy."
The man knelt by her, put his dying arms around her, and she laid her head upon his worn breast.
"We will leave them together,"
I said to Gabrielle. I took the poor little girl's hand and led her from the room. She was in a frantic state of excitement.
"I said he was not dead," she repeated. "Oh, I said it. I was sitting by my window a few minutes ago and I saw him in the garden. This time I was determined that he should not escape me. I rushed downstairs. He knew nothing until he saw me at his side. I caught his hand in mine. It was hot and thin. It was like a skeleton's hand, only it burned with living fire. 'Mother is dying. Come to her at once,' I said to him, and then I brought him into the house."
"You did well. You acted very bravely," I replied to her. I took her away to a distant part of the house. An hour later, Mrs. Heathcote died. I was not with her when she had breathed her last. My one object now was what to do with poor little Gabrielle. In consequence, therefore, I made arrangements to have her interview with Heathcote. It was no longer possible for a wretched man to remain in hiding. His own hours were plainly numbered, and it was more than evident that he had only anticipated his real death by some months. I saw him the next day, and he told me a few brief words of the story of his supposed death and burial. "I'm being severely punished now," he said. "For my one great sin of life, I am a solicitor by profession, and when a young man is tempted to appropriate some trust funds, hoping, like many another has done before me, to replace the money that he lost was discovered. I married and had a happy home. My wife and I were devotedly attached to each other, and I was not strong, or more than one physician had told me that I was threatened by some serious pulmonary affection. About 8 months ago, the blow which I never looked for fell.
I need not enter any particulars. Suffice to say that I was expected to deliver over £12,000, the amount of certain trusts committed to me, to the rightful owner within 3 months' time. If I failed to realize this money, imprisonment, dishonor, ruin would be mine. My wife and child would also be reduced to beggary. I had effected an insurance on my life for £15,000. If the sum was to be realized, it would cover the deficit in the trust and also leave a small overplus for the use of my wife and daughter. I knew that my days were practically numbered, and it did not strike me as a particularly heinous crime to forestall my death by a few months. I talked the matter over with my wife, and at last got her to consent to help me. We managed everything cleverly, and not a soul suspected of fraud practiced in the world. Our old servants who had lived with us for some years were sent away on holiday, had no manservant in the house except a chairwoman who came a certain number of hours daily. You managed your supposed dying condition with great skill, I answered. The hemorrhage, the ghastly expression on your face, is sufficiently real to deceive even a keen and clever man like Mackenzie. Heathcote smiled grimly. After all, he said, the fraud was simple enough. I took an emetic, which I knew would produce the cadaverous you approaching death, and the supposed hemorrhage was managed with some bullock's blood. I got it from a distant butcher, telling him that I wanted to mix it with my meal to feed my dogs with. And how did you deceive the undertaker's men, I asked. My wife insisted on keeping my face covered, and I managed to simulate rigidity. As to the necessary coldness, I was cold enough lying with only a sheet over me. After I was placed in the coffin, my wife would not allow anyone to enter the room but herself. She brought me food, of course. We bored holes in the lid in the coffin, too. Still, I shall never forget the awful 5 minutes during which I was screwed down. It was all managed with great expectation. As soon as ever the undertaker's men could have got out of the way, my wife unscrewed the coffin and released me. Then we filled the bags with flour, which we had purposely hidden for that same purpose. My supposed funeral took place with due honors. I left the house that night, intending to slip to America. Had I done this, the appalling consequences which have now ended in the death of my wife might never have taken place. But at the 11th hour, my courage failed me. I could not do much to shield my wife and child, but I could not endure the thought of seeing them ever again. Contrary to all my wife's entreaties, I insisted on coming into the garden for the selfish pleasure of catching even a glimpse of Gabrielle's little figure as she moved about her bedroom. She saw me once, and I escaped to the shrubbery by which a door was kept, which we purposefully unlocked before she reached me. I never thought I would ever again transgress, but the more the temptation assailed me, and I was not proof against it. My health failed rapidly. I was really dying, and on the morning when my wife's illness began, I had suffered from a genuine and sharp attack of a hemorrhage. She found me in the wretched lodging here, and I was hiding in a state of complete misery, with almost destitution. Something in my appearance seemed suddenly to make her lose all self-control. "Horace," she exclaimed, "I cannot stand this. When you die, I will die. We will carry our shame and our sorrow to our unhappy love into the grave, where no man can follow us. When you die, I shall die. Oh, to see you like this drives me mad." She left me. She told me when I saw her during those last moments yesterday that she had hastened to end by powerful use of Indian hemp. That is the story. I know that I have laid myself open to criminal prosecution of the gravest character, but I do not think I shall live to go through with it. Heathcote was right. He passed away that evening, quietly in his sleep. Poor little Gabrielle. I saw her once since her parents' death, but it is now a couple of years since I have heard anything about her. Will she ever get over the severe shock to which she was subjected? What does she hold in the future to store for her? I cannot answer these questions. Time alone can answer that.
Thank you for the 10 months, quote. Squall. Ugh. Can't speak. Been speaking too much. Can't speak anymore. Let's see. Here we go. Ugh. And it's really hard to hallucinate someone when you've never seen them, so that definitely proved that he was still there. Words hard! Yes. Of course, the printing in this book is a lot smaller than I'm used to, too, so that's why I fumbled over them so much. Oh. But interesting stories. Wish I hadn't fumbled over them so much, but oh, that was about to happen. Oh. Stretch again. Ow. Let's see. Now to see who's on that we can raid. I wonder how long Sophia's gonna go. She's a little bit longer than I usually do. How many? Okay, I know. I thought I had one open. Huh, weird. I think she is trying to finish up Gulliver's Travels. Nope, she is already off. Well, dang. Guess I won't raid her then. I wonder who she rated. Oh well. Don't know if any of the other readers are still on. Don't see any of them. Ugh. Yeah, I'm really not seeing any of the other people on. You know what? I see someone on. We're going to raid Oni. He's usually here most of the time, so I don't think I've had a chance to raid him yet. Okay. I will hopefully sleep well tonight. And thank you for coming in, and thank you again for the 10 months. Wow. I guess I will hopefully see or at least notice people here tomorrow for... I'm probably going to finish up the Green Fairy book, which is crazy. And I don't know if I'm going to try to find any absinthe to drink for the stories or not. I'll figure it out. Didn't get enough contributions when I started it, so absinthe and drinking the green, well, drinking absinthe and reading the Green Fairy would be hilarious, but I'll stick to my blood orange wine. Well, have a good evening, everyone, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Yeah. All right.